There's something that is probably very common for people to do, especially if you're new to Ignition, that can get you into a little bit of trouble when you're maintaining your views. If you have to make changes and you're renaming things or moving things around on the page, you might be breaking your logic. Let me show you what I'm talking about. In this view, I want to hook up this table's filter to this custom component, my search field here. So I'm going to go to my table. I already have my filter enabled, and I'm hiding it in case you're wondering why it doesn't show up here. If I get rid of this here, you can see that's normally what the filter looks like on the table, but you can hide it with display none, and then you can bind this text property to another component. So I'm going to go to a property binding here, and using this button, the Browse Properties button, I'm going to browse to my other component and find my value property, and it gives me this path. Now this path is a relative path from my table component where I'm doing the browsing to my search component where I grabbed the property from. If I hit OK here, this will work. I can search and it filters my table. The problem is that if I change something about that path that we were just looking at, if I rename this component, for example, I can name it text field. Well, right now, since I just renamed it, something interesting can happen. I'm not sure if there's just something with this version of Ignition that I'm using, but the search is continuing to work, right? So it looks like changing the name of this component didn't break the logic, but in reality it did, because if I close this view and reopen it, now my table has no rows. The filter does nothing. And if I look at my table, my filter text is null. If I open that binding, I can see I have a bad not found error in my binding preview. And that's just because this path is no longer valid. I changed the component name from search to text field. And I'd get the same result if I moved this component somewhere else in the view, and that would change this path as well. So there's a better way to do this that can avoid ever having to go back into your bindings and fix paths. And this isn't just with bindings, this is with scripts as well. Basically, anywhere that you have this Browse Properties button, you might be running into this issue where you're creating relative paths from one component to another. And in perspective, you'll see that this is referred to as a brittle path. Every component in perspective can reference the view directly, the view that it's a part of. So I'm going to go to my view and I'm going to create a new custom property, and I'll call it search. And I'm just going to give it a binding so that it has a default value of an empty string. And then what I want to do is go to, well, each of these components. I'm going to first go to my search, and I'm going to create a bidirectional binding here to that new custom property. And look at the path. This path is not relative. It's not brittle. It will be the same no matter what happens to this component, where I move it, how I rename it, doesn't matter. And I can even right-click it and copy that binding, and then go to my table, and I can paste it. I can paste that binding onto my filter.text property, and now my filter will work. Let's actually select the view so we can see this property update when I type in something here. And you see that it updated my view custom property, which also updated my table. So you can think of it like a middleman property, essentially. Anytime you need to reference another component's properties, it's really nice to set up properties on the view itself. I'll do this when I'm creating forms where I have a lot of different components and a save button, And then in my save button, I need to reference all of the values in my form. So I will create bindings from those components. And the direction is important, right? I wouldn't want to create the binding from my view custom property to the component. It's got to be from the component to the view, because otherwise we're going to have to do the same sort of thing where we have a brittle path. If I were to go from the view to my text field, right now I have a brittle path. So direction's important. You go from the component to the view, but that way you have all of those values tied to a location where you can always reference the same way. Now, the other part of this, of avoiding brittle paths, is when you need to perform some kind of action. So for example, I have add and delete and refresh these buttons here. And one way of creating an action here for my delete button is I could have it set up like this, where I'm referencing the table in my button script. And you can tell this is a brittle path because look at this. I have to go from this component up to the parent component, then that parent's component, and then that parent's component, and then eventually I get the child table component. So if anything changes in this path, this logic will just break. A better way of doing this is going to be with a message handler. A message handler has two parts. This part here that we're looking at is just using the system perspective send message function, where you give a message type and you can list a scope. By default, it will be the page scope. And you can also include a payload if you wanted to send a payload of data to another component. It's really useful for sending data from one view to another, but you can do it within a view as well. So part one, we're sending a message. And then part two is we're going to receive that message. So here on my table, let me get out of this. You go right click, configure scripts, or control K. And here's my delete row message handler. As you can see, I have the view scope enabled. You can enable multiple scopes at the same time. And here's my logic that looks pretty similar to what I had on the button originally. But instead of using brittle paths that can change with the structure of the view, all of this code is just referencing the table itself. Self props selection, self props data. And so this code will never break. And the added benefit of using message handlers even within the view like this is that now the code that I used to have on this delete button can live on this table where it really belongs, because it's a functionality that's really related to the table, right? We're deleting a row. The button doesn't need to know what that logic looks like, but the table should. And organizing your logic where the logic needs to happen is just a better way of organizing your code. Makes it easier to maintain in the long run. So now if I take a look at this, if I select this and hit delete, and then if I move this, let's try to move this button somewhere else, and I can still use it and it still works because the logic here is completely disconnected from the structure of the view. We're just sending a message, and that message is being listened for on the table. So that's really all I wanted to share. Just a quick little lesson with some tips on how to structure your views and create component interactions in a way that will avoid having broken paths when you need to maintain and make changes to your views. So hopefully you found this helpful. I know many of you probably already know all of this, but maybe you don't. I personally didn't learn this until fairly recently, and I wish that I had learned it a lot sooner, because it does make maintaining views a lot easier. So if you have any questions or comments, feel free to leave them below and check the links in the description to learn more about our tech and what we do, what kind of services we offer for businesses. Thanks for watching. We'll see you in the next one.